A balkanized imperial core clings to its old glory as the world crumbles around them. An emperor with no clothes commands legions from a gilded cage. States that resemble corporations, and corporations that resemble states. An ancient power rising from the dustbin of history to reclaim their bygone hegemony. From a Western perspective, the 21st century reads as a cautionary tale. Pulp fiction about a futuristic empire high enough on their own supply to not realize the cracks of the foundation. An elite that drinks the Kool-Aid, and a working class that can't afford anything else. Wally levels of morbid obesity and consumerist placation. Dystopia realized by a loose collection of oligarchs and politicians, cheered on by a peanut gallery of slack-jawed gooners clamoring for another hit from the dopamine box in their pocket. The Bible asserts that the meek will inherit the earth, but unless meek has suddenly become a synonym for Chinese, I have my doubts. In the 3 decades since America assumed unipolar control, China has played the global order like a fiddle. In the West, we experience the current moment as American decline, but the history books are likely to portray it as Chinese ascension. America laid the groundwork for its collapse, but China capitalized on it. China's rise from an impoverished nation on the margins of world politics to a global contender might seem sudden, but history tells a different story. A cycle of struggle, collapse, and rebirth has defined China for centuries. Far from being an anomaly, today's sprint towards superpower status feels more like a return to form. To understand that return, we need context. What bent China out of shape in the first place? The period between the First Opium War in 1839 and the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 is often called the Century of Humiliation. Over those 110 years, China lost its regional dominance, its global standing, and much of its sovereignty. It began with Britain invading because China had the audacity to regulate the drug trade. It ended with Japan's brutal invasion, fueled by the audacity of China merely existing in their neighborhood. In between came more blows, a second British invasion, a first Japanese invasion, and even a multinational invasion that included both Britain and Japan. The Century of Humiliation was not just a bad time. It was the violent dismantling of China's autonomy. 100 years earlier, China had seemed untouchable, among the world's most prosperous nations. But in just a few decades, it went from continental power to imperial plaything. Everyone has a breaking point. For China, that point arrived with the rise of nationalism and communism. The first sparks came during the humiliation itself, when nationalist rebels, the Boxers, laid siege to Beijing's foreign quarter. For a moment, it looked like China might claw back control. Instead, an army of 8 nations crushed the uprising, a brutal reminder of just how powerless China had become. A decade later, revolution toppled the emperor and gave birth to the Republic of China. But what was meant as a rebirth quickly fractured. Without a dynasty to hold it together, the country slipped into chaos. A republic on paper, but in reality, a patchwork of warlords, foreign powers, and opportunists feeding on the corpse of empire. Then came Japan's invasion of Manchuria. The atrocities of Imperial Japan were countless. A final flourish to a century of suffering. The nationalists and communists, once bitter enemies, united to resist the invader. This was perhaps China at its lowest point. Fragmented, humiliated, and weak. But beyond its borders, the world itself was catching fire. The sparks that would ignite the Second World War were already in the air. China had been broken, battered, and carved apart, but it had not been destroyed. The embers of a civilizational state still smoldered. Japan would not rule China for long. 2 American bombs, a Soviet incursion, and the end of an apocalyptic war opened the door to a new Chinese era. The United Front collapsed soon after, and the Civil War resumed. This time, the communists had the momentum. Backed by royal support, the Chinese Communist Party pushed the nationalist Kuomintang to Taiwan, where they remain to this day. Out of the ashes of World War II, a divided China emerged. The People's Republic of China was born, determined to reclaim its place on the world stage. At first, Beijing leaned on Moscow. China fought alongside the Soviets and North Koreans in the Korean War. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt at rapid industrialization that led to widespread famine and arguably the death of millions. By the 1960s, cracks with the Soviets widened. In 1964, China tested the bomb, granting the nation a new level of destructive capacity. 2 years later, Mao unleashed the Cultural Revolution, a decade of chaos that tore Chinese society apart, even as it cemented his rule. China supported North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, an irony given its own ill-fated invasion of Vietnam in the late 1970s. But geopolitics was shifting. In the 1970s, Washington opened to Beijing, seeing China as a useful counterweight to Soviet power. For China, it meant new diplomatic ties, new capital, and new markets. Mao's death in 1976 ended his iron grip. Deng Xiaoping rose to power, blending communism with market reform. This quote-unquote socialism with Chinese characteristics created a hybrid of state control and market dynamism. A system unlike any other, but a system that worked. Millions were lifted out of poverty. China rapidly industrialized. A new kind of capitalist class formed, one that was at least theoretically on the leash of the CCP. By 2001, China had joined the World Trade Organization. It was no longer just a rising power. It was an indispensable link in the global economy. Behind the scenes, politics shifted too. Without Mao, the party elite forged a new balance of power, one that would last until the rise of Xi Jinping. And that brings us to understand Chinese politics, you first need to understand how power is divided. On paper, there are two centers of authority: the official government of China and the Chinese Communist Party. In practice, the two are inseparable, woven tightly together, and within both, there's more ideological diversity than outsiders might expect. Starting with the government of China, the National People's Congress, you find what looks like a multi-party system. In reality, it's a coalition dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. Alongside it sit the left Kuomintang, a breakaway faction from the nationalists during the Civil War, a handful of smaller parties, and an army of unaffiliated independents. The real center of gravity in Chinese politics lies within the Communist Party itself. It's here that rival factions compete for influence, not at the ballot box, but through patronage, networks, party loyalty, and sheer political maneuvering. For decades, the party was shaped by a balance of factions. The princelings, descendants of China's revolutionary elite. They carry the legacy of their powerful families and often pushed for market reforms, strong state-owned enterprises, and global integration. Many of China's top leaders, including Xi Jinping, are princelings. The Tuanpai, or Youth League faction, technocrats who rose through the Communist Youth League. Often seen as populists, they emphasize social equality, poverty reduction, and protecting workers left behind by rapid modernization. Hu Jintao, China's president before Xi, came from this camp. The Shanghai clique, tied to former leader Jiang Zemin. This faction represents coastal elites and urban technocrats, favoring rapid economic growth, foreign investment, and close ties with global markets. Alongside these, there are the hardliners. Not an organized faction so much as a tendency, backed by the military and security services. They emphasize party discipline, national strength, and resistance to foreign pressures. Until recently, Chinese politics was an exercise in consensus building and intra-party factionalism. But that all changed with Xi Jinping was a princeling, the son of Xi Jinping, a high-ranking Communist Party leader who later fell from grace. During the Cultural Revolution, Xi's father was persecuted, and Xi himself was sent to the countryside, where he endured years of hard labor. The experience exposed him to the hardship faced by ordinary Chinese. After Mao's death, the elder Xi was rehabilitated and returned to senior positions, playing a role in China's early economic reforms. But it was his son Xi Jinping who would rise to the very top of the party hierarchy, ultimately forging a legacy that eclipsed even his father's. How the younger Xi managed to forge that legacy is a story that is both impressive and dramatic. When he rose to power in 2012, Xi was seen as a compromised figure, a princeling with revolutionary blood, but not considered especially dominant. His rivals underestimated him. Within years, Xi began dismantling the careful consensus that had defined Chinese politics since Mao's death. The Communist Youth League, once a powerful pipeline for future leaders, was gutted. Its influence in the Politburo collapsed. The Shanghai clique, once synonymous with technocratic reform, withered under corruption probes. Even the princelings who had nurtured Xi's rise found themselves sidelined. Xi's main tool was the anti-corruption campaign. Framed as a moral crusade to cleanse the party, it swept aside thousands of officials at every level, conveniently removing rivals and consolidating loyalty. At the same time, Xi tightened his grip on the military. The People's Liberation Army, once a semi-autonomous power center, was restructured from top to bottom. Generals loyal to old factions were purged. The PLA now answers directly to Xi, not just the party. By 2018, Xi had abolished term limits for the presidency, a move that shocked even seasoned party watchers. Where his predecessors had stepped down after 2 terms, Xi made clear he intended to stay. The result is the most centralized leadership China has seen since Mao. But unlike Mao, Xi presides over a nuclear-armed, industrial superpower deeply embedded in the global economy. The party once ruled by consensus. Under Xi, it rules by command. Although Xi is the undeniable face of modern China, he is also not the sole force behind their success. To understand that, one must understand. China's economic success is often credited to Deng Xiaoping's market reforms, and it's true. Freeing the market attracted foreign investment, fueled industrialization, and gave China leverage on the global stage. But that's only part of the story. Unlike the West, China never surrendered control. Every corporation, labor union, and capitalist ultimately operates at the pleasure of the Communist Party. This system allowed China to build a hyper-industrialized economy while avoiding the kind of financialization that has hollowed out Western industries. It also makes China's economy highly strategic. Production, investment, and policy are aligned to serve national priorities. One clear example is China's drive for self-sufficiency. Most essentials the country needs, it produces at home. Where it cannot, it works to close the gap. Take semiconductors. China still depends on foreign technology, but it has poured billions into domestic chip production to break that dependence. Then there are rare earth minerals, the obscure metals critical for everything from smartphones to fighter jets. China dominates global supply, not by accident, but through decades of careful policy and investment. And beyond its borders lies the Belt and Road Initiative. Trillions invested in infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. These projects don't just open new markets for Chinese companies. They secure shipping routes, tie countries into Beijing's economic orbit, and give China political leverage across the developing world. It's a sharp contrast to the United States and its allies. In the West, Wall Street chases quarterly profits, even if it means outsourcing industry, offshoring supply chains, or hollowing out communities. In China, the party chases national power. Every factory, port, and investment is part of a larger design. Speaking of larger designs. This is where we get to the heart of China's rise. Beijing has managed a delicate balancing act, thriving within the American-led world order, while simultaneously competing against it. It's done so through a mix of strategic economic policy, carefully built international coalitions, and what critics call debt trap diplomacy. China's success is not just a story of domestic reform, it's a story of strategy in a world still shaped by American power. For decades, Beijing worked within the US-led order, joining the World Trade Organization, attracting Western capital, and exporting goods to American consumers. But it also worked around that order, building alternatives that advanced its own influence. Institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and blocs like BRICS gave China new platforms outside US control. The Belt and Road Initiative extended its reach across the continent, creating a network of states economically tied to Beijing. One of the sharpest criticisms of China's rise comes in the form of so-called debt trap diplomacy. The idea is simple. China offers massive loans to developing nations for infrastructure projects. Ports, railways, power plants, knowing many of these countries may never be able to repay. When they default, Beijing can swoop in, seizing control of the project or gaining political concessions. Perhaps the most famous example is Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Unable to service its debt, Sri Lanka granted China a 99-year lease on the port, a move critics saw as Beijing turning economic muscle into strategic real estate. But the story isn't so simple. China isn't the first to use finance as leverage. The United States and Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank have long issued loans tied to strict conditions, structural reforms, austerity measures, and privatization. Many developing nations see these Western loans as their own kind of debt trap, locking them into dependency on the dollar system and foreign capital. China's model is different, less about dictating domestic policy, more about securing strategic footholds and long-term influence. Still, the result is similar. Nations saddled with debt and great powers with leverage. So whether you call it development, diplomacy, or entrapment, the effect is clear. Both Washington and Beijing use finance as a geopolitical weapon. The difference is style. Where America writes conditions into contracts, China builds ports and railways. Where the US projects power through sanctions, China projects it through credit. It's not just debt trap. America relies on many of the same strategies as China, but with a different style, and at times with diminishing returns. Washington does lean more heavily on military power, and its policies are often shaped by the short-term interests of its capitalist class. The difference is visible in practice. The US poured trillions into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to leave behind instability and little strategic gain. China, by contrast, poured trillions into the Belt and Road Initiative, ports, railways, and pipelines that knit the entire region into Beijing's economic orbit. The US turns to sanctions and tariffs to punish rivals. China uses its control over rare earth minerals as a quiet leverage. One plays for immediate resolutions. The other plays the long game. The goal of that long game? While China's rise to superpower status is impressive, it's not unprecedented. History is full of empires that rose from humiliation to dominance, only to stumble under the weight of their own ambitions. For those who watch my video, How Empires Die, you'll know I don't believe that the collapse of the American-led world order is inevitable. But I do believe China is building a secondary order, one that could rival Washington's dominance, or at the very least constrain it. The timing is striking. Just as America's global influence appears to fray at the edges, China's ambitions are reaching their peak. Whether this moment becomes remembered as the dawn of a Chinese century will depend on more than China alone. It will depend on how the US adapts, how allies choose sides, and how smaller nations navigate the space between giants. Empires do not rise or fall in isolation. They collide, they compete, and they coexist until history decides otherwise. That being said, I am very much hoping for coexistence. The atomic paranoia of the Cold War is something I am blessed to not have lived through. And if we are going to live in a multipolar world, I would prefer that multipolarity to be peaceful and productive. But what do you think? Are we destined for a second Cold War era? Will China surpass American power and become a new global hegemon? Will America correct its recent mistakes and change course? Be sure to leave your opinion in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. This is my third video, and this is all fairly new to me, so your support means a lot. Most importantly, thanks for watching.